Okay, we're on the backside of notes for day 8, and we're talking about inverses. And remember, an inverse is a reflection over the line y equals x, or you can think about it as the x's and the y's switching or swapping places. Okay, so number 4 says that the equation f of x equals x squared is graphed below. We're going to determine if the inverse will be a function. So remember, we're looking for the original to pass the horizontal line test, and it's not going to pass. Okay, a horizontal line will hit that graph in 2 spots. And so we were going to go ahead and say, determine if the inverse will be a function. I think our prediction is no. It will not be a function. Okay, because right now this one has y values. Okay, repeat. And so if we swap them or switch them like we do in an inverse, okay, once they're switched, then we're going to have x values repeat. And if x values repeat, no function. Whoops, function. Okay, so in part B, it says explain your answer to part A. And so we actually just kind of did, okay, right here. And so basically we can just say also that original graph fails horizontal line test. So inverse graph will fail vertical line test. Okay, and so there's our prediction. Okay. Let's go ahead and see number 5. It says find the inverse of each of the following. And these are going to be kind of important. This is something typical they ask us to do. And it says to find the inverse of an equation. And so we have to remember that anytime you say inverse, basically all you're doing is swap x and y. However, with an equation, equations like to be in y equals form. And once you swap x and y, usually they're not in y equals form, and we have to go ahead and rearrange them. Okay, so in the first one, we're going to go ahead and swap x and y, and a lot of people get confused because they don't say y to swap it. But remember that f of x is a synonym for y, and so a lot of times I will draw literally the y right over it as my first step. So super easy first step, and then the second step, I'm going to go ahead and make that y that I just wrote into an x. And then I'm going to make the x into a y, and now the x and the y have swapped. Okay, but notice this is an x equals form, and so that's the very last step, is to get this back into y equals form. So if you notice where y is, you're going to realize that there's a 2 and a -5, and both of those have to leave in order for him to get by himself into y equals form. And it's kind of PEMDAS backwards, so we're actually going to add 5 since we're solving for 5 instead of plugging in. Okay. X plus 5 is literally just x plus 5 equal to a 2y. Those have canceled. Okay. Next step is to divide by 2. However, remember that everyone gets divided by 2. And so we end up, a lot of people struggle with this, but there's technically a 1 in there. And so that's actually 1/2 x plus 5 halves. You can leave it as 5 halves, or 2.5 is also correct, equal to y. Okay. One last thing they do is they replace y with f inverse of x equal to 1/2 x plus 5 halves. So it looks like the inverse of f of x, and that's finished. Okay, next one. So again, first step, we're going to switch x and y, but then a lot of people are like, well, where's y? So remember, g of x is a synonym, and now that it is visible, now we're going to go ahead and switch them. And so that y I just drew is going to become the x equal to 1/2. That x is going to become a y, and then plus 8. Okay. Remember, the next step in an inverse is to put this back into y equals form. And so there is the y. And so now we're going to go ahead and get it by itself. We have to get rid of the 1/2, and we have to get rid of the 8. And so the 8 is going to go first. Oops. And we're going to subtract it. Okay. And x minus 8 is literally just x minus 8 equal to 1/2 y. And these are canceled. Okay. Now we're going to get rid of the 1/2. You could divide by a half. You would need parentheses around it. You could divide by 0.5, which is a little bit easier, but then when you do it on the other side, a little bit tricky. And so remember that the Algebra 2 way of getting rid of a fraction is to actually multiply by what they call the reciprocal, which is just a flipping of the fraction. Okay. Half times 2/1, which is 2. 2 times a half there is really just 1, and 1y just becomes y, and that's why this works. Okay. On the other side, though, we have to realize that that's being multiplied by the whole side, and so that's distribution. And so 2/1 is really just 2, and so 2 times x is 2x, and then 2 times -8 is -16. Okay. One last step, we're going to go ahead and write this as f inverse of x equals 2x minus 16. And there's the inverse of the original. Actually, I shouldn't call it f, should I? That's a g. So we're going to go ahead and make that and fudge that into a g inverse of x equals 2x minus 16. So we are looking at the original and what the original was called. Okay. All right, guys, the next two questions we're cutting out of our curriculum for this year. These are a little bit trickier. And the reason why they're trickier is that they have 2 x's, which means they will have 2 y's, and it's a little tricky to solve for y. And so for the sake of the year, we're going to go ahead and cut those ones out that have double x's in it. Okay, we're going to head to one more question right on the bottom. And it was very similar to the first two we were doing. It says, given f inverse of x equals -3/4 x plus 2, which equation represents f of x? And so what's tricky is that they actually gave us the inverse and they want the original. The cool thing is that the steps stay the same. First step is to swap x and y. Okay? And second step is to solve for y. To put it back into y equals so you can change it back into the inverse. All right, so we're going to do the same exact steps because this is still talking about an inverse. And so we're going to go up here, and f inverse of x is really the y, okay, just like it was in the last two that we did. And then that y is going to become an x equal to -3/4. The x becomes the y, and now the x and y have swapped positions. Okay? Now we're going to go ahead and solve for y. So if we take a look where y is, he needs to become by himself. And so we realize that there's a -3/4 that needs to leave and also a +2. And we're going to make the +2 leave first by subtracting it. Okay. X minus 2 is literally x minus 2 equals -3/4 y. And that's finished. Okay. Again, we have a fraction to remove. And so the Algebra 2 way is to multiply by the reciprocal. So if we go ahead and flip this fraction, it would be -4/3. And so we're going to go ahead and multiply by -4/3. Okay. The negative does not have to stay on the 3. Okay? Doesn't matter actually where that negative is in the fraction. It could be with the 4 or with the 3 or out in front with the fraction bar. Okay? But again, why this works is that a negative times a negative is a positive, and 3/4 times 4/3 is a +1. And so they cancel, leaving you with just y equals. Okay? But on this side here, we have to make sure that we distribute. And so that's going to give us -4/3 x. And then a negative times a negative is a positive, and 4/3 times 2 is actually 8/3. You can math bracket in your calculator. Okay, then we're going to go ahead and take the y, and we're going to turn it back into f of x. We're not going to say the inverse because remember the inverse was what they gave us. This is the original, which we got by following the same steps that we do to find an inverse. Okay? And so we're going to look for -4/3 x plus 8/3, and that's choice 3. Okay? Hopefully that was good on inverses. So remember the two steps. Swap x and y. Remember that the y is the f of x or the f inverse of x. Okay? And then to put it back in order and solve for y so you can put it back into f of x form. Okay? All right. Great job. I'll see you guys on the next one.